Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone that's joining us on our 20th anniversary, Center Buddhist Studies 20th anniversary event series. And I'm very happy and excited to introduce again for Dr. Albion Butters, who was with us last week and gave us a fascinating survey of 14th century Tibet and the different kinds of doxographical issues that were going on at the time. And today he will be giving us a very interesting lecture that comes from his current work with the Khyentse Vision Project, but I'll leave Dr. Albion Butters to tell us more about this. Just briefly to introduce him again, for those of you who weren't with us last week, Albion is a scholar of the history of religions, and he specializes in Tibetan Buddhism, among other things. And he got his PhD in Columbia University. He's currently the editor of for the Khyentse Vision Project, whose mission is really to translate the collected treasures of Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo. He's also the editor of the Studia Orientalia Electronica, which is an online and peer-reviewed open access journal in Asian studies. And he has published, he has numerous publications, very interesting, very diverse. I leave it for those of you who want to know more, just join him in academia, edu, or you can find his publications online. And he currently lives in Finland, and he was kind enough to join us and to share his recent research on 19th century Tibet. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Albion. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Halkias, and thank you all for coming today. It's a pleasure to be here again after last week's opportunity. Now we will fast forward from the 14th century to the 19th century. Quite a jump, but we'll see a few similarities along the way, I believe. And before we get started, I'd like to just frame from my own side, my own interest in this period, the 19th century, and why I chose it to talk about today. As Professor Halkias mentioned, I'm currently editor at the Khyentse Vision Project, and it's part of a large international effort to translate the corpus of Khyentse Wangpo. And this is really taken my time. It's been a total joy to immerse myself in this work over the last almost 2 years, and there is so much for me to learn about it that to speak on this subject is actually a great excuse for me to deepen my own understanding of the significance and the value of what I'm working on with that project. So hopefully this talk will give a bit of context for that effort, and it'll inspire people to go visit it afterwards and the text that we're translating. So to begin, I would like to give a little overview of what I'll be talking about today. First, I think it's appropriate to frame the period, historically speaking, 19th century Tibet, what was going on. I'll just very briefly touch on that, and then discuss this question of Rimé, which is in the title of the talk, which very in brief means non-sectarianism, not being partisan regarding teachings. As the historical point of focus for the talk, I will really shine some light on the three main figures behind the Rimé movement. I can say movement, but as I'll explain, it's more than a movement in Tibet. And then what is Rimé itself? Like what are the different aspects of it, and what could one point to as being signs of its development and production? How did it survive? And then finally, if there's time, I will close out by looking briefly at a lineage prayer that I was responsible for editing as part of the translation through the Kensei Vision Project that just gives a very, how would you say, qualitative view of Rimé in practice from the point of view of a composition by one of these masters and how they put it into practice in their textual composition. So, beginning with the context of the 19th century, of course, we're dealing with the latter part of the Qing dynasty. Tibet is under Chinese rule at this point, and this is, how would you say, perhaps there's a lot of differences of opinion of how autonomous Tibet was during the centuries preceding the 19th century. But by the time we get to the 19th century, one could perhaps see a semi-autonomous aspect with the Dalai Lamas, even in their minority, let's say the Gelugpa school, being very, very strong in the governmental administration of the Tibetan plateau. And you have a weakening by the 19th century that then allows people to discuss the political involvement at that period in relation to the great game, right, of Great Britain and Russia and China. So a complex period, but internally, one can also see that it was not necessarily so harmonious, in the sense that the Gelugpa school had survived over the past centuries without competition from the other schools, and politically that strength led them to amass large pieces of land. It was a very powerful institution. They well, had the governmental control of the country, and other schools that were perhaps much stronger earlier in history. If you remember last time we spoke in the 14th century, it was the Sakya school was giving way to the Kagyu school. Well, now it's the Gelugpa school, and those schools got pushed to the margins a bit, as it were. So if the Kagyu and the Sakya school were a bit less, then certainly the Nyingma school of lay Buddhism in Tibet was even more marginalized. And this was also especially the case geographically, not just in terms of power dynamics from a political level, but on a geographical level, that you had a marginalization of who was the prevailing form of Buddhism. What was Tibetan Buddhism at that point? So in our talk today, we'll be looking at the Rimé movement as coming from the eastern side of Tibet, and in particular the Kham area. The three main figures that we'll be talking about today came from that region. So it's important to keep in mind that when one is speaking of Tibet at this point, it's not just a homogeneous geographical setting, but different power dynamics going on the plateau at the same time. That informs the picture of Rimé as something pushing back against the Gelugpa, order of what was the accepted school. So to go now to Rimé and this concept of non-sectarian or non-partisan, of course there were predecessors. There were people in the history of Tibet who were not especially sectarian or how would you say, marginalizing other traditions. Last time we spoke of canonical formation with the canon that was developed by Tung in the 14th century, and how the Nyingma Lama Longchenpa was pushing back on that. Already here we see he was not alone in this. He was part of his times, and the ecumenical nature of the universities of that time at Samye and Sangpo Neotog, and how students would go and study with many masters. Historically in Tibet, there is that tradition. It's important to keep in mind. Tsongkhapa also drew from different traditions. The fifth Dalai Lama, Ngawang Lobsang Gyatso, he was a famous practitioner of Dzogchen and built a temple, for example, outside in Lhasa there to practice that. Nyingma school of great perfection, or practice of great perfection. Shabkar Rinpoche being Gelugpa, but then seeing the value of traditions across the board, even non-Buddhist traditions. And none of them, however, used this term Rimé itself per se. So although they may have received teachings from a wide gamut of mentors, of lamas, of gurus, they were not necessarily promoting something or self-referentially identifying themselves as that. That's what comes now in the 19th century. So what does this word Rimé consist of? Ri, the Tibetan word Ri, means sectarian or biased. Me is not. So very simply put, not biased, non-sectarian. And how would one define it? In the, how would you say, history of Tibetology, different people have had different ways of looking at it, whether it's an attitude in terms of praxis and being, how would you say, welcoming of this practice or that practice, not judgmental, welcoming, like that. Another more common one has been to frame Rimé as a movement. It's been called an eclectic movement. That's to say something different, something maybe, how would you say, a little on the fringe. But I would agree with later Tibetologists who have problematized this definition of Rimé by saying it does not appear historically to be a social construction, that these lamas went and said, let's go create something called Rimé. Let's create another school, over and against the Gelugpa, for example. Right? That's not what was going on. It was more of a I would argue a worldview, a view in which one's understanding of the teachings was defined by relative and ultimate, and depending on the context of one's own incarnation, if one grew up in a certain school, one didn't abandon it and then become Rimé. No, they had that already, that flavor, so to speak, but they might incorporate other practices, again, from a relative level, depending on the need of that moment. And so a teacher would perhaps go and seek teachings from a master, from another tradition, in order to fill out their own understanding philosophically, their own practice on a praxis level. It had different applications, and that's at the relative level. But I believe that there is also an ultimate level that one can speak of Rimé as understanding that one can rise above such differences in an understanding of Buddhism as a transcendent vehicle, right? To get beyond such differences. So I will speak to this idea of view a little bit more later on, but I wanted to introduce the term up front here just to contextualize what it is that we're talking about. To move now to the three main figures that I indicated that we would be talking about, the three great Rimé lamas, who are known as the Kien, Konchok, Sedo, right? And you would have Zhonggong Hongshuo and Chokyur Lingpa and Jamyam Khyentse Wangpo, also known under his Terton name, Pema Oso Donglok Ling. These are the three figures that history regards and Tibetans regard as the main progenitors of the Rimé tradition. So I'll speak of them in turn, and you'll forgive me if I use my notes a bit here, because this is to do justice to them. It's good to go a little bit deeper. So I would begin by mentioning Zhonggong Hongshuo. It's his name in Wylie, and his dates born quite early in the 19th century, and he belonged to multiple traditions himself. He was, as it were, tonsured and made a religious order, the Bön, as a young boy. Then later he would become he would join the Nyingma order at Shechen Monastery, and then finally he would gravitate towards the Kagyu tradition in Palpong. He was very, very deeply learned. He studied with many masters. It said that by the age of 30, he had studied with as many as 60 different masters. So if you remember already during his upbringing, he had moved from the different traditions. This suggests from a young age, he falls into the same maybe tradition as Longchenpa in the 14th century, just having that diversity in his own religious DNA. He was not outside of the political situation in Eastern Tibet, even though he was deeply involved in religion, and I will speak to his activities. He was also, how would you say, warned of a conflict that would come in Kham. Even as he was not so old, at one occasion as he and the others were opening a sacred site where they would find termas, he was given some medicinal pills and advised war will come from the east. It's believed that was in relation to a certain warlord from Kham. The fellow's name was Nyake Amgong Gongpo Ngomgyo, and he was a warlord from the Nyarong Valley who started going around and basically trying to take over Kham. Without going into great detail about that type of strife, it's significant to note that Zhonggong Hongshuo did himself get involved in this. He was in his 50s by this time. The prophecy was 10 years earlier, and it said that he was able to somehow bring a close to this very potentially dangerous situation that was going on there in Eastern Tibet, in Kham. One could say that his religious leanings extended on the basis of the traditions that he was raised in, which is to say, from the Nyingma side, very much interested in Dzogchen. From the Kagyu side, very much inclined towards Mahamudra, but he also was a adherent or fan of the Jonangpa school, with the Kala Chakra and the Shentong philosophical view of other emptiness. He felt that it was possible to reconcile Shentong in such a way that it did not mean reifying the other emptiness, Shentong, as something, not making it something other and something else, that it still was in accord with two truth theory. I won't go into the philosophical details of that, but just mention it because, again, it shows his inclusivity, his willingness to open and go into areas that, well, had been declared heretical by Tsongkhapa and then later the Gelugpa school. He was very, very prolific. He authored over 90 works, and these ranged from across a number of subjects. But I think it's very, he, like the other lamas, were extremely, extremely prolific. Very, very, very much engaged in promoting the textual aspect, which I will get to, which is a core aspect of why Rimé, I believe, is recognized as such a contribution, and one can actually talk about a production of Rimé. Of his texts, one could mention the Treasury of Encyclopedic Knowledge, which is a doxography, the genre that I spoke about last week, which is to say a presentation of the different views, philosophical views. It's seen as his magnum opus, and there are many commentaries to it that he himself did, auto commentaries. It's being translated into English. One can really find a great deal of wisdom from that one book alone. The Treasury of Precious Instructions is in relation to personal instructions that are given from the teacher to the disciple. The Treasury of Kagyu Mantras are related to the praxis as of the Kagyu school. The Treasury of Precious Termas, the Rinchen Terze. I mentioned the Tibetan there because many of you may have heard of this. We'll come back to it a little bit later, but it's a collection of the hidden treasure texts through the history of Tibet. It's imagine just an encyclopedic work of those. And finally, we would have the Uncommon Treasury, which has his own profound treasure revelations, on his own termas in there. So he was a tertan himself, discovering texts. It's important to say at this point that he, even as he worked with different traditions, as he was collecting them and presenting them in these texts, he was doing so in a way that preserved their respective approach and not blending them, not mixing them. This is something that is very important to keep in mind with Rimé in general, that it's not like it's all good, let's make a big soup and throw it in the pot and mix it up, but rather a attention to the special aspects of each distinct lineage, a preservation of that, an appreciation of that without losing the details. I will also, as I get into these other figures, just mention that what was involved with this process to collect these texts. Not only he did it, also our next Lama, Chogyur Rinpoche, Chogyur Lingpa, he did the same, as did Jamyam Khyentse Wangpo, that they traveled around Tibet. They traveled around Eastern Tibet, they went to Central Tibet, maybe not so much Amdo, and they collected teachings that were in danger of being lost. It's perhaps worth noting that Tibetans had a view of history. This is something that Alexander Gardner discusses in his book, that a view of history that sees things that happened in the past, recording things that happened, as opposed to a great march towards progress, like, so let's do this to make something out of what happened. More like, let's preserve what did happen. With that in mind, one can begin to understand the historical work that he and the other two lamas were doing as they rode around Tibet, preserving texts that were in danger of being lost. Why in danger of being lost? Well, as I mentioned before, there was a certain marginalization of the lesser known, of the less powerful schools. But also, I think one could note the tendency in a very rich tradition that has new texts coming all the time, that old texts are in danger of being forgotten or left aside. One should also remember that there are geographical aspects of different hermitages, of different centers that are away from the main power, away from the main resources and financial support, that simply don't have the money to keep their temple in repair, or the lineage is in danger of dying out, instead of there being a very perpetual lineage transmission. Are there enough people to keep it going, to keep the transmissions alive? It was on that basis that there was this need in the 19th century to really make a preservation effort. It has been argued, actually, that it's in large part because of the work of these Rimé lamas that so many texts that we have today actually did survive. Without their work, it's unclear what would have. So that's just a little bit of context in relation to the activities that were involved, traveling around and actually going to places and actually getting these texts. As I said, though, it's not as that he was alone in this. The next person that I will speak about is Chogyur Lingpa. Chogyur Lingpa was a Terton, first and foremost, which means that he was a treasure revealer. He was seen as a large treasure revealer, a major Terton in the history of Tibet, who recovered 40 volumes of termas. That's a lot of text to discover. Regarded as a reincarnation of Prince Murub Tsenpo, who was the second son of King Trisong Detsen from the imperial period. Like Zhongnong Kongtrul, he was well regarded from birth, and that gave him, as it were, the position of power, even in the Kham was on the outskirts of central Tibet. It had its own kingdom, Kingdom of Derge, and it had its own hierarchies and its own, how would you say, large families, and its own reverence of Tertons and reincarnations of reincarnated lamas. So to be recognized as this prince is possibly one reason why then he was able to have the level of activity that he did. Um, his dates, if you look at 1829 versus Jamgon Kongtrul, 1813, 16 years younger. And we can look at Jamgon Khyentse Wangpo, 1820, also younger. I'm sorry, older than Chogyur Lingpa. This is an important thing to keep in mind, that here he came and he was kind of like the younger one. They were already established more than he was. And from a socio-cultural point of view, coming on the scene and being a text revealer, as a discoverer, when in the beginning he may have been starting to have discoveries, discover texts, to have a relationship with them, they could verify that what he was actually, revealing was legitimate. That's an important aspect of this triad of figures that we're talking about here. All three of them were Tertons. All three of them were discovering texts, but that relationship between them is within a context of not only the Nyingma school, like we saw in the 14th century with Longchenpa and Orgyen Lingpa, but now with the Sakya and the Kagyu and the Nyingma, working in a collective Terma discovery matrix, one could say. To speak briefly to some of the texts that he discovered, the reason why I would like to just touch in on a few of them, because they give a taste. They give a taste of what types of things were being brought up as valuable let's say beads of light, or aspects to be shared across the schools. One Lama would come over to, for example, study the Lamrim Yeshe Ningpo, the gradual path of the wisdom essence. It would be included in later editions of the Rinchen Terze as a very significant text. Lamrim texts, as you may know, in the Gelugpa school, for example, going back to Tsongkhapa, are about the gradual stages of working through the different levels of realization, praxis in a gradual way. In this context, the Lamrim is not so much sutra oriented, but much more tantra oriented. It was seen as teachings that had been gathered by Yeshe Tsogyo, more than 1,000 years ago, and had been hidden as a terma. And he discovered this text, and it was one that he co-discovered with Jamyam Khyentse Wangpo, which is to say that, imagine, one found it and the other said, yes, that's right, or they had independent visions. In a commentary then on the text that those two discovered, Jamgon Kongtrul would then write a commentary on it. So again, you see them working together, and in his commentary, he describes these teachings on Salung practice. So the winds and the channels, wind energies, essences, bindus, is kept secret, like the name of the empowerment itself that authorizes the practitioner to engage in these teachings. So very, very esoteric teachings. Anu Yoga, working with the winds and the subtle channels. This for those of you who are interested, has been translated by Erik Pema Kunzong out of Denmark as the book Light of Wisdom. And upon apparently discussion with his teachers, it was decided that it was agreed that it is preferable that these teachings be shared at this point. So it's something that I believe I can say you could look at, even though in the 19th century it would have been regarded as very, very secret. Another text that he wrote, the Zappa Kordun, the Seven Profound Cycles, the Terma, the Three Classes of the Great Perfection, a dual revelation that he did again with Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo. In this case, it was an earth treasure, which is to say, one pulls it from the ground, from the earth, and that was done at a place that would be very, very significant. I will speak to it later, called the Lotus Crystal Cave near Zongsar Monastery. And this was a place apparently where Yeshe Tsogyo herself had practiced. So it had history, and yet it had significance as a place to, for Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo especially, to practice in the 19th century. Another one, the Zabtik Drotrok, the Profound Essence of Tara. Chogyur Lingpa is highly regarded for this, and that's why I chose to put the picture of green Tara on the right there. This text is significant because on one level it's a Kriya Tantra, which puts a lot of essence, and outer Tantra, which puts a lot of emphasis on cleanliness and purity. And then, according to Gyaltsen Khyentse Rinpoche, it was also a highest Yoga Tantra. It didn't only function at the level of Kriya. So it was, I believe, regarded as a mother Tantra with emphasis on Hayagriva and Vajravarahi. And so one can see that even the different levels on a vertical level, not extending only across the schools, but on a vertical level through the doxographical divisions and categories, could be, how would you say, broken and opened in an inclusive way, understood in that way by these masters. The Rimé being, again, perhaps seen as a type of view, as opposed to just a movement. Okay. Finally, I would mention, in regards to his works, the Gazette of the 25 Great Sites of Calm. Why do I mention it? Because these lamas were very, very active in opening different areas. I'll speak to it, but of their locale, making them sacred, and finding these power spots, and preserving power spots. So how would you say, perhaps giving life, breathing new life into the historical and the energetic aspect that is tied with Tibet, the geomantic relationship with the very land as significant and historically charged for spiritual practice. That's an important aspect, I think, to keep in mind here. I can refer you to Alexander Gardiner's dissertation on this subject for anyone who's interested in that. And the reason why I mention his name, Alexander Gardiner, is because he has written a splendid book on Jamgon Kongtrul. I will give you the title at the end, but for future reference, this period, this milieu, and Rimé in general, I would highly recommend looking at his work. In fact, I will read a quote now on that note from him in relation to the way in which these lamas, Chogyur Lingpa with the other two, collected the texts and went around discovering and finding these sacred places. It's almost impossible to comprehend how many places they visited, how many new treasures they collectively produced, or how many existing teaching traditions and ritual systems they collected, edited, published, and transmitted. And they traveled on foot or by horse. They lit their desks by candle or oil lamp, and they wrote by ink on handmade paper that was expensive to acquire. They also spent years in personal retreat doing the practices that they were teaching and publishing. So this is a good moment to actually, again, speak to the process of what they were doing. Apparently, it was not always easy to get these texts. And so when they did arrive at a place that there was a teaching, that there was someone of knowledge that held the tradition, that there was not a great hurry. It was important to respect the time that was necessary to get the teachings, to get them in full. And that meant getting the full transmissions. And what does that mean? I mean, in the historical tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, you may know there's getting the Lung transmission, the verbal transmission, there's getting the empowerments, which is to say the full ritual investiture of the permission to practice. There's getting the, how would you say, permission of the deities, forming a relationship with the deities of the practice. And that only comes through actually engaging in the practice itself. So it wasn't, to use a profane example, like going out and collecting Pokemons or something. I mean, it was an in-depth, slow process that could take years. And for example, Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, whom I'll speak of next, I mean, he went different times in his life, the different periods when he was out collecting, I believe for a total of 13 years on the road. 13 years of his life traveling around by horseback with an attendant doing this, a single attendant, and ranging as far as central Tibet. So that's something to keep in mind, the level of commitment on a physical level. And if you believe in karma, a karmic ripening, that when you go to a place that you have the good fortune, because as we know, it's not always the case that when we set out to do something that we actually are able to achieve it. Causes and certain conditions don't necessarily always support that. So if one takes a step back and regards the amount of material that they were able to collect, one has to regard that as well. Amazingly fortunate set of causes and conditions, circumstances that they were able to do that. Now let's go ahead and move to Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, the third. The reason why I have Manjushri here on the right side is because his name, Jamyang, is related to the name for Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom in Tibetan. And the same is the case with Jamgon Kongtrul. So that's why I have an early form of Manjushri here as well. That's, I think, an important thing to keep in mind, is the how would you say, the tone or the theme of the tradition that comes through different lamas is always important to keep in mind. So in this case, perhaps it's not surprising that these lamas that were so interested in the promulgation of knowledge would be so closely affiliated with Manjushri. And it comes up, the name Manjushri comes up not only in the sadhanas that they found that are connected to the Bodhisattva, but in their poems and how they self-referentially refer to themselves as Manju Gosha, for example. Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo does. So He was regarded from a young age as a reincarnation of Tartse Khenchen Jompa Namkha Chime, who was, I believe, 17th, early 18th century Lama, important Lama. Tartse Khenchen meaning great scholar. So again, you already see the appreciation for the scholastic in his earlier incarnation. And then later, he came to be regarded as a reincarnation of King Trisong Detsen, which is significant when you think that the king of Tibet, there from the 8th century in the imperial period, was invested with the teachings by Guru Rinpoche, by Padmasambhava, that would then be hidden as termas to be discovered all of these centuries later. So Jangmyung Khyentse Wangpo was regarded as, having, as it were, the whole body of these termas there already in his previous incarnation, and then the permission to, as it were, reveal them himself. He had a terten name also, Pema Osal Do Ngok Lingpa. He traveled at a young age. He was born into a family from the Sakya tradition, and around the age of 20, he went to central Tibet for a period of 4 years to, I believe, study at Ngor Monastery there. And then he came back to Kham, and then was invested at Zongsar. But the reason why I mention this travel to central Tibet at the age of 20 is because not to compare myself with Jangmyung Khyentse Wangpo, other than the fact that when I was that age, I traveled, and it affected my life so greatly that then it has allowed me and driven me to do that in my own life, rather than staying local in America, or even in one state of America. And I don't know if that's really was an important aspect for him, but it's not hard to imagine that he already was introduced to that level of that practice of going out and making contacts, of going and coming, seeking knowledge from the different areas. It's not, how would you say, so rare. I wouldn't suggest that it was so rare to travel from Eastern Tibet to Central Tibet. But at the same time, one does need to remember that the provinciality that exists today in different areas was most likely also the case there, and just a question of one's own personal inclination to travel, because that's what he did. As I mentioned, at a young age, he went forth and began collecting. He had come from a perhaps you could say aristocratic background, in that his father was the secretary for the king of Derge. So he had some means, most likely, and some social status, and that probably helped him in his having an attendant, for example, and going out in his missions, having the financial support to go and make offerings for the text that he was getting, or preserving the different temples, or making temples. I believe he created a dozen or so hermitages himself, and paid for them with his own means. So that's not an insignificant thing to mention here as well. One speaks about the development and production of Rimé, that there was a financial aspect that would allowed it and made it possible. Interestingly enough, after his period of travel, he then spent the rest of his life, the second half of his life, in relative solitude at Dzongtsar Tashi Latse Monastery there in Kham. And that's significant in the sense that having collected texts, now it was time to compile them and write about them. So he was very fortunate to have a long life and the ability to work on everything, a place to do that. His textual creation and corpus was immense. He conserved texts as well as commented on them. If texts were abbreviated, he might supplement them. If things were lost, he might fill in the gaps. So, you know, the question of authorship and editorship, the lines are not necessarily blurred, because in the colophons of the texts that he works on, he says the first verse can be found here. I wrote the rest. Or here I give a poetic composition adding to this other text. So as from our side, historically, we can look at these texts as wonderful layered compositions that preserves a little some understanding of the provenance of what came before. Approximately 28,000 pages. This is what the Kinsei Vision Project is currently in the process of translating. It, as a project, may take our international team of 20-some people 10 to 15 years, just to give an idea of the scope of what we're talking about, how many texts. One can speak of his Kabum and the Kababdun. The Kabum is the collection of his own writings, 13 volumes, and the Kababdun is a collection of special transmissions that are, one could say, not just Terma, I'll speak to them, which add up to 24 volumes. So this is, I believe, why it's so clear that these three lamas were absolutely the key to Rimé. Briefly, I would like to hit again on the idea of Rimé as an attitude and a non-dual view. In this case, I'd like to just come back to this after looking at these figures in order to see how they understood each other. Zhonggong Kongtrul praises Khyentse Wangpo for his pure view without bias and is critical of those who maintain, quote, the relative superiority and inferiority of different Buddhist traditions, or the relative purity or impurity of different lineages, and are full of meaningless suspicions and resistance concerning even their own traditions, like the proverbial skittish old yak that causes himself to become shy. One thing I believe one could say is that this is a teaching from Urgyen Tokyo Rinpoche, who mentioned that during this time, those who held the Rimé view were not necessarily going out and advertising themselves as such. And actually, if somebody came to them and said, you're Rimé, they might actually be humble and say, no, it's a difficult thing to do. So that's a very important aspect of this, that it's not a movement, that it's not an evangelical, patting oneself on the back that I'm so great, that I'm so open-minded, but rather a real effort, a very, in a sense, humble effort to be accurate and authentic to the various traditions and practice them in accord with their historical strands and lineages. This is an extremely important thing to remember. Um, it's also important, I would say, one could note that the relationship between these lamas, they knew each other and they could give praise to each other. They worked with each other, but there are also stories that for example, Jamyam Khyentse Wangpo, I mean, he had a temper apparently, and he had a great sense of humor apparently, and they were real people too. When young, originally going to study with Jamyam Khyentse Wangpo, Jamgon Kongtrul had to ask his guru, is this okay? Can I go there and study with this fellow? And his teacher was, yes, he's definitely someone. So, with his guru's permission, he went. But then later in life, perhaps then when Jamyam Khyentse Wangpo's brother had passed away, Alexander Gardner mentions this as something that he really loved in the life histories of these lamas as real people, that then Jamgon Kongtrul said, well, maybe it's time to come, receive some transmissions from, where his monastery was, half a day's walk away from Zongsar. So without going into, there's so much that could be covered here, but I think it's important to remember the human aspect underneath all of this as well, that they were supports for each other in their collective work, but also the realization was in relation to this, they would receive teachings from each other. They would transmit back and forth. Very, very precious type of relationship. Moving on briefly to how the Rimé tradition may have survived. Well, these teachers did have reincarnations after all, and they had countless students, but the reincarnations themselves were an important aspect. For example, Jamyam Khyentse Wangpo, he is regarded as having 5 different reincarnations, as you see here, based on body, speech, mind qualities, and activity. So if you see Jamyam Khyentse Chokyu Lodro here, a reincarnation of his enlightened body. Khyentse Kongtrul Rinpoche, enlightened speech, and also seen as an incarnation of Jamyam Kongtrul. And then Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, enlightened mind. Just to give examples, right? That this is an important aspect in the spread of Rimé, in the preservation of Rimé, that the transmission continued from the students through teachers into the 20th century. And it's important to note that this was important because at the same time that Rimé was catching on, you had, for example, forces that didn't care for it, that pushed back. One could very pointedly identify in this Pabomka Rinpoche, who lived at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, who was apparently not so bothered by it until around the age of 40, but then became driven to exterminate teachings that he saw as outside the pale, himself being Gelugpa, but also favoring the Kala Chakra. I mean, not Kala. Sorry, I'm sorry. The protector Dorje Shukden, who was very wrathful, and on that basis, he felt compelled to go and throw down statues of Guru Rinpoche and burn monasteries, and it was a lot of persecution was endured, perhaps first on the part of the Bön, and then the Nyingma, then Kagyu, and then less on the Sakya school side. But that's an important, how would you say, aftermath of Rimé that needs to be kept in mind. Then one moves to if reincarnations were an important part of promulgating Rimé, sanctifying space was another. As I mentioned before, power spots around the country. This is the place that I mentioned earlier, Pema Shalpuk, the Lotus Crystal Cave. And so old temples would be restored, new temples would be built, but then these treasure locations, I think the best word is to describe it is to open them. That basically it was done in a religious ritual way, that it could be even announced to the public that here these lamas were, and that they were going to do this opening, and the people would be there and gathered around, and then they would, you know, pull the text out of the stone, and it included even the aristocracy, you know, that the king could even be attending this. So it's a very interesting social cultural phenomenon, at the same time as profoundly significant for the discovery of the text that they would be editing and redacting. I would briefly just describe one of these issues. Like this place here, they mapped out the place as a spot. You know, they identified a spring that was like apparently very, very significant, medicinal water, an overhang where Bibla Mitra had practiced. So they were tying the historical to the present, finding and building, opening this sacred space where then they would practice. It wasn't just in theory, but it was actually to make that place, you know, it was a place where they themselves would live. Khyentse Wangpo participated in the sanctification of Janggon Kongtrul's hermitage above Pelpung, for example. He helped his friend get that place as a hermitage. Khyentse and Chogyur Lingpa again collaborated on the sanctification of a site near Zongsar, Rongme Karmo Takzong, a cave site that became the hermitage for the monastery's college at the beginning of the 20th century. So over a 2-week period, 2 identified caves, they were found, deities were propitiated, they extracted a treasure from a lake, and this is the story that I wanted to get to, so bear with me while I read it. When the group went up to the lake, a small body of water in the midst of a scree field more than 15,500 feet, or 4,700 meters above sea level, Chogyur Lingpa declared that a Naga, basically like a local spirit, was guarding the treasure text, and that everyone should be quiet so as not to offend him. Khyentse is said to have responded, "What is there to fear in a Naga? It's a worm. The so-called Naga has no primordial existence. If he is there, I want to wake him up. I do not fear Naga. If there is a Naga, let it come here." At which point he threw many stones into the lake. The others, obeying Chogyur Lingpa's command, refrained from throwing stones. Chogyur Lingpa then attempted to retrieve the treasure using his robe as a lasso. When the lake water suddenly churned violently, Chogyur Lingpa shrieked and fell back. Khyentse Wangpo slapped him, scolding him that as Padmasambhava's representative, he ought not be afraid. After the treasure was finally obtained, Khyentse Wangpo claimed that they succeeded because of the rocks he had thrown in, and on the way down the mountain, he continued to throw rocks at people, claiming that everyone he struck was purified of their negative karma. It's a wonderful story showing in action how they were working together. Didn't sound like it was always necessarily easy, but certainly exciting. That lake is this Sengo Yumso. Finally, of the aspects that I would say were so vital to the preservation of Rimé is the preservation and discovery of texts themselves. I mentioned at the beginning the Rinchen Terzud Chenmo. This is the collection of termas, not just collected by them, but spanning, the history of Tibet, consolidating them all together in one collection. And apparently this is a group effort in the sense that Jame Khyentse Wangpo was really responsible for a lot of the collection, and then Jomrong Hongtrul was very much involved with the editing of them. That's how that collection was formed. And the original collection, I believe, was 60 volumes, quite large. And then the later Shenzhen edition, the Shenzhen edition is something like 72 texts were added later, like I mentioned before, the Lamrim Yeshe Ningpo, or different texts. So that's a very important one to mention. The next is the Kabum, like for example, the collected works of Jame Khyentse Wangpo. And then finally, the Kababdun that I mentioned before, the 7 special transmissions. One could very briefly touch on them, that these range across a different, how would you say, a variety of discovered texts. So you have the Kama as the transmission of Sutra and Tantra, going back all the way to the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, but also including in the Nyingma tradition, Samantabhadra texts from the primordial Buddha, for example, and that type of transmission. Then you have the Sater, or the earth treasures, which are referred to as actually physically extracting a text from the earth. The Yangter, the rediscovered treasures, because apparently when it was understood from Padmasambhava that when there was only one concealment of a text, it was unique. Once it was discovered, translated, written down, it should be put back to be rediscovered later, not to be lost, just in case. Gongter, these are mind treasures that the teacher would basically have appear in their pure vision. And that's as I mentioned last time, a lot of the Nyingtik texts that Longchenpa was pulling were mind treasures, seen as a very special type of terma. Then the Nyengu, the oral transmissions, the hearing transmissions from one teacher to the disciple, very private. And the Daknang revelations, which, for example, receiving teachings in a dream would be an example of that. And then the Jedren, the revelations from memory, for example, from a past lifetime, something like that. So this gives an example of the types of texts that exist in the collection that the Khyentse Vision Project is working on right now. We're already at 10 after the hour, but I think it's actually possible that I briefly touch on the example I wanted to give of the text. Personally, myself, getting into these texts one after the other, editing them, has been beyond description as a treasure for me, because these, as you know, they come alive in going into them, not just talking about the text, but actually working closely with them linguistically, but also taking a step back from a text critical point of view and thinking about, well, what may have been the thoughts involved during the authorship of these texts. So I won't apply that hermeneutic interpretive strand to the praxis text, to the sadhanas or a terma text that may have been discovered. That's not what I'm trying to critique or analyze. But in this text, it's a lineage prayer that was actually very, very purposefully written by Jame Khyentse Wangpo when he was basically sharing a sadhana on Manjushri. So supplication to the lineage gurus for the profound sadhana of the praised and noble Manjushri that bestows lucid intelligence. I won't read in detail the supplication, it's a couple pages, but what I'll point to is the way that it proceeds in this lineage prayer to the Indian masters. It works through the translators in early Tibet. It works through the early people in the Sakya school. From them, we get to Rinchen Sengye in Bhutan in the 14th century. Tashi Rinchen, the master of Ngorchen. We see the Ngor as the important monastic center for the Sakya school. But then we begin to see other teachers that are outside of the Sakya school. And I will continue to the next page without going into detail of the specific ones. I pray with unwavering devotion to all the glorious masters of the sublime lineage, right? Through this invocation, by my fingers of threefold faith upon a jeweled lute, in praise of Manjushri, the gentle protector, grant your blessings here and now, so that lucid intelligence regarding the ocean of the outer and inner fields of knowledge may increase, and I may ultimately attain omniscient wisdom beyond the extremes of samsara and nirvana. So he is supplicating and praying for these lamas throughout different traditions, all the way from India to the present day when he's writing it, that are specifically the who's who, the important luminary people in a strand that are focused on Manjushri. He's identified them as the ones. And he's not only concerned with the ones in his own school. That's my point. So when I was looking at the text and I began to, do footnotes and thinking like, who are these figures, right? I'm looking at them and I'm identifying them and I'm thinking, all of a sudden it popped off the page to me that, wait a minute here. This is Rimé in practice. This is him actually showing that, yes, he appreciates Kunga Rinchen Gyatso, Jonang, student of Taranatha, and a Shangpa Kagyu, a Nyingma here, a Tropa Kagyu, Drikpung Kagyu, Drukpa Kagyu. I mean, look at the variety that we have in this one document. So I just share it with you here very briefly as just an interesting exercise in seeing how the texts themselves can speak about the view that they had, that these authors had. And if one were to pull back from this, maybe after 10 years and do some quantitative analysis, it would be very, very interesting from my perspective, at least, to look at the Kabum, look at the collected works and see what is the provenance for the different texts. And on a statistical level, where and how much come from the different traditions. This work has not been done. So that is something for future research. I believe that will close my talk for today, but I will leave you with these books that were helpful for me in pulling together an understanding of this period, and Rimé in particular. Matthew Ackerster's translation of the biography of Jamgon Khyentse Wangpo by Jamgon Kongtrul, and then the life of Jamgon Kongtrul on the other side that was done by Alexander Gardner a few years. Finally, I would invite everyone to please visit the Khyentse Vision Project because we're publishing these texts. They are open access and free and beautiful, poetic and rich and profound. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Albion, for this fascinating talk and for all the information that you brought together. It's indeed fascinating these times. And I can see, again, this level of creativity in the 19th century, just as in 14th century. But there was a completely different historical context and setting that set things in motion. And I'm really curious if you think there were I mean, you kind of mentioned it, but you didn't really go much. I think you covered a lot. But the historical times, what do you think may have been some catalysts for the Rimé movement? I mean, on the one hand, I think you mentioned the Gelugpa hegemony and the kind of religious climate that was prevailing at the time. At the same time, you mentioned that there were certain lineages or texts that were going extinct, or certain transmissions. And those are different pieces together, and I'm just thinking, what was it that motivated Khyentse Rinpoche and Jamgon Kongtrul and to actually go live their place and travel and collect this? Was there, I mean, what sensitized them towards this mission? I'm just trying to understand it more. I don't know, culturally, historically. I don't know how we can. Why then? Why them? Yeah.
Yeah. It's a very interesting question, and you're exactly right in seeing. I believe it's a combination of the two things, and you use the word hegemony, and that I was searching for that word. That is the appropriate word, I believe. The combination of the text getting lost and the hegemonic aspect that they had to push back against. But if I were to go out on a limb here, my own supposition would be that it was a local phenomenon, that you had these people from Kham, that it was a local, how would you say, understanding of themselves out there, and then to go to central Tibet, to Ngor, to study and see the level of support that the Sakya school had at that point, and the heritage and the tradition, and then to come back to one's own local area and the things are dying out. It must have been a very stark contrast.
I see. Yeah,
that's one idea.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Of course, I like your approach to say trying to see the human side of the story. I mean, you know, what really motivated these great scholars to actually to go on this search, and yeah, what triggered them. And of course, the chemistry between the three of them, that's very interesting in itself. You know, the way they collaborated. Anyway, I'll just open for any questions. I think some have come in, so please type in your questions, comments for Albion, and let me see what has come in. One of the questions says, could you elaborate more on how those masters advocated Rimé movement in avoidance of intermingling different unique teachings of different schools?
Yes, that I believe at one point in researching this, I read that Jamgon Kongtrul was so respectful of Jamyam Khyentse Wangpo that when he would practice, he would sound like the person from that school. And so when I heard that, it made me actually kind of pause and think about what that meant myself, having gone to different teachings from, for example, receiving teachings from His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama to a Nyingma Lama, and what the difference is, and the protocols, but also just the type of language, right? And that for him, it was not just a, how would you say, a respect of trying to actually follow and that tradition, but that it was so deeply embodied that it was actually that he was actually able to take off that hat and put the other hat on, right? Mm-hmm. And whether this was done in an outer way or not, I can't speak because I wasn't there. But again, referring to a teaching by Organ Topgyal Rinpoche, that he was, I think, joking, like if you were to take your, red, like Guru Rinpoche style hat, right, Nyingma style hat and then go to a Gelug monastery. Like, you wouldn't exactly be fitting in here. So on a very, very practical level, on a praxis level, cultural level, he was able to wear multiple hats. But then on a, I think, even more important level, deeper than the sociocultural, he was able to preserve the lineage by having received the empowerments, the transmissions, the connection with the deities that I mentioned, and actually deepen the understanding through the practice that it was actually real and tasted and experienced, and therefore could be passed on and transmitted, not only textual preservation.
Mm-hmm.
I
Fascinating.
hope that helps answer the question.
Yeah. And just following on that, what about like the language? I mean, I'm always wondering, when you have that kind of cross-fertilization, coming from different traditions and the use of terms having very different meanings, let's say. I mean, something as simple as Sem, mind, and how this is understood, let's say, in a Gelugpa context or in a great perfection context. It's the same term, or bodhicitta, and then to be able to move from those different semantic interpretations based on the different lineages and the different types of texts. I mean, this in itself is a very interesting topic, on how they manage and what is coming through. I think you as a translator must be really finding this fascinating, when you have to translate some of these terms in English, and which kind of interpretation are you going to use? And I think this is great. I don't know if you want to comment a little bit on this.
Well, I will say that it's humbling in the sense that it places a great level of responsibility on the translators and editors of our project as we're working with the text to understand them within the context in which they were being written and then shared. And if we are faced with questions, which scholars which Himalayan scholars we are going to ask about that. So, some texts are very, very specifically Sakya, and they have a Lomdre background that it is very important to know about and have that context. And, Drupal Kuntu teachings, or to have the teachings that relate to that. That's on one level. Then, as you speak about, the specific words, the multivalent aspect on different layers. And so, for example, Sem from a philosophical definition versus a Dzogchen definition, Semni, for example, and very different. But that's where you have the doxographical sophistication coming in with Jamgon Kongtrol. And you saw it with Longchenpa, but I think you can see it here as well, that there's that ability to understand that the right frame in which the word is being used, and then nuance it, connect the dots, or keep it separate, or play with it back and forth, right? Get into that. Those are interesting conversations that happen. The last thing I would say is that, from what I've seen so far of Jamyam Khyentse Wangpo's work, there's an artistic and aesthetic quality of language that can really be so beautiful. It needs to be appreciated and treated and translated by someone who has a great sensitivity with the English language, that it's done in an aesthetic way. That's a different level.
I think you're definitely a very good match for that. Judging from your writing, I think you're probably doing a great job. But you're right. I always find this very difficult, to convey the meaning and at the same time convey the beauty without compromising either. It's really an art to translate. Thank you, Albion.
I'm just an editor. Others are translating. Yeah.
Right. Well, the editor has an important job to do in that. There's another question coming in, and he says, "Thank you, Dr. Butters. I have two questions. First, please, could you talk a little bit about whether the Rimé masters ever collected works from the Gelug tradition? If not, was that mainly because the Gelug tradition did not need preservation in the same way, or was there any implicit aversion to the Gelugpas, given their dominance? Let's start with that question before I go to the second one.
You know, I have to confess ignorance on a quantitative level. I wouldn't throw an answer back without having really understood the whole corpus yet, and we're still working on it. We're still translating, you know, and indexing. The index is close to being done, but you know, have I had the opportunity to go through the thousands of titles and do that type of analysis? I have not. What I have seen, though, does not support much use or preservation of the Gelugpa text, and I believe that you're right, that it already had a healthy tradition. It didn't need that, and it wasn't their focus anyhow. So I would say that something may be found. Crossover may exist. I mean, for example, a teacher from these traditions may have very much wanted to receive teachings in Guhya Samaja, for example, and then in which case that would have been the Gelugpa school would have been the right, you know, place to go there.
Okay. And the second question says, did Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo write anything by way of commentary on the major sutric philosophical treatises, for example, in Chandrakirti's work? I know that he instructed Mipam Rinpoche to compose textbooks for use in the Sedra of the Nyingma tradition, but did he write anything like that himself?
Great question. I'm inclined to say yes, just on the basis of one of the texts that I've been assigned. I haven't gotten into it yet. If I remember correctly, The Waterfall of Blessings is the title I'm pulling off the top of my. But it's a Drupta text. It's a doxographical text, and it would get into this type of philosophical stuff. And I mean, it's what 150 pages long, so it's not insignificant. It's a book in its own right. But the fact you mentioned Mipam Rinpoche is a very good point. As you know, his work being in that direction would very much support Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo himself, having done such philosophical, very fine-tuned philosophical commentaries. I would invite you to come to the Khyentse Project as we publish the index, because there you'll be able to start seeing, and the text that I'm talking about editing has been translated. It's on my docket, and let's say by the summer it should be out. So come see it.
Wonderful. And there's another question. This is an interesting one because I think it's kind of different from the previous ones. The question is, can we say Rimé is in some sense the evidence that Buddhism is not a religion?
That's such a deep question.
It is a big question, yes.
It's like the appropriate answer is no answer on that.
Okay, no answer to that question.
No,
okay.
I mean, the no answer is an answer, because like I said, Rimé can operate at the relative level and at the ultimate level, and ultimately, is it a place of speaking?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, one can turn it around and say, well, the very fact that Rimé, there was a necessity for Rimé, is evidence that Buddhism did become a religion at some point. Right. You know? So it depends how you see it and interpret that, right? Great.
Exactly right. And to that point, when asked apparently if he was Rimé, Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo himself would say, "I am a student of Shakyamuni."
Great answer.
Take it all the way back outside of religion and go right back to the source.
Right. Very good answer. Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Well, Albion, I think we have reached our time and I don't see any other questions. So I want to thank you once again for joining us. This was a real pleasure. And I hope in the future we can have you physically here as well, not just virtually. And I wish you all the best with the Cancer Vision project. I'm very fond of it. I also go and check it occasionally and see your work. And I think you have a great team. You're doing a fantastic job. And thank you once again. Have a great day.
Thank you. Hey, have a good day, everybody.
Bye-bye.